While we have learned to live with many of the inconveniences of a pandemic response, we have also had to navigate a human existence that often presents us with emotional pain and physical loss. To discuss this further and examine that while life is full of loss, by nurturing a world of new things, these feelings can be addressed. I'd like to welcome lecturer, consultant and coach Breandan Ward, who worked in leadership roles in investment banking over 15 years during a period of progressive sight loss. Breandan now gives seminal talks on the topics of disability and inclusive leadership across for-profit and non-profit sectors in Ireland, the UK and overseas. So I'd really like to give a warm welcome to Breandan Ward.
Good morning, Neil. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for the introduction. And I'd like to share some reflections from my path on this journey, which, as Peter was just sharing to us, is a path that we share. And what I mean by that is to say this: we might be at different stages of a journey of sight loss. Some of us might have been blind from birth. Others might have lost sight suddenly, all at once. And then, like me, there are many who, during their lifetime, started out with pretty decent sight and then, not by choice, but by chance, started to slowly lose vision. And what I wanted to ask is, as we spend the next 15-20 minutes together, is to think of ourselves all together on this path, on this journey. And it's a journey that we share. None of us are crossing any kind of finish line, but all of us know there are milestones that we have passed in our journey so far, and also further milestones up ahead that we hope to make. And really, as Peter just outlined in terms of resilience and the example that all of you have shown over the last 20 months within the Fighting Blindness community, is we are in it together. It is not an individual journey. It is not a journey where any of us are passengers. It is actually a common journey. And my hope in these next few minutes, as I share my own experience of that journey so far, is to say, you know, no matter where you're at in that journey, there are people behind you, people with a newer diagnosis, people struggling perhaps with an old diagnosis. There's people behind you that we can turn back and offer a hand to, whether it's through peer support, whether it's calling in, saying hello, supporting them in any way that we can. And sure enough, there's also people ahead of us on the journey. They've been through perhaps more than we have, and we look to them for guidance, for advice and support. So we are none of us crossing a finish line. This isn't about climbing Mount Everest and saying, look at me, we're done. I have resilience, 100%. That's not the message we want to convey today. So we're on a shared path, and what I'd love to do is share 3 insights that took me quite a long time to unearth. And as Peter so rightly said, the strength we seek is often within ourselves, and it's there all along, but it happens to be buried under all sorts of things. And I wanted to share my own journey of trying to unearth some of that. And some of that digging process is a bit mucky, and I'll give you as honest and real an account of just my own journey on this path that we all share. There's a few slides on the screen, and I can't see them, so if you're lucky enough to see everything clearly, you'll be able to read them yourself. If, like me, you can't see it well enough, I'll mention what's on the slides for the benefit of everyone. And what I might do at the end of each of the 3 sections, and there'll be a couple of minutes each, so not lengthy, I'll pause for a few moments, maybe in a day where there's a lot of listening, a lot of information, and after yesterday's sessions as well, it's good for us to have a chance to pause and just let some of the reflections percolate. So if you like to jot things down, in whatever format is accessible to you, or even just in your mind, ponder a little bit. I'll deliberately pause for a couple of moments here and there to give everyone a chance to do it, and also to line up any questions, comments, insights of your own that you'd like to share, and we'll have a few minutes at the end for that. So with that said, I'll mention very briefly before we go to the next slides, a quick background. I'm Breandan Ward, I'm 43, I'm from County Monaghan, and proudly so. I studied commerce and French at UCD, and that involved working and studying in France for a time. And after college, I moved to London to work in investment banking, which I kind of fell into. I started as an intern at Goldman Sachs back in 1999 and fell into it, got a permanent job, stayed there, and then moved from Goldman Sachs to Morgan Stanley, where I worked for another 5 years. And it was actually during the early years of that first job that I started to have trouble with my eyesight. So it was getting harder to see the screen. I was worried, I was worried. I was actually quite sad and upset about the whole thing, but in quite a common way, common to many of us, I suppose, you kind of push these things away and you try and just struggle on as best you can. And that's very much what I did. But with time, with the diagnosis, with support from my employers, I was able to get back in the saddle in my job. And I worked in London for 10 more years. And then I moved to New York with work for 5 more years. So that was very much a full-time employment journey with needing accessibility. I can't really say after the first year or so that I'd spent much time processing the ongoing sight loss that I experienced. And I'll come back to that as one of the lessons I learned, in many ways, the hard way. So I'll share that in a few moments. And after banking, after 15 years of that, I actually left. So I left Wall Street, I left the city, and I went back to school to study. And this kind of itch I had to do something that I felt could make more of a difference to the real world caught up with me. And I went to study a master's in public administration, and then went on to start teaching on the topic of disability, and also work as a coach and a consultant and an advisor. So I've moved significantly, if you like, away from the markets and high finance into what I feel is a much more, for me, worthwhile pursuit, and that is asking myself, what am I doing about the situation of people like me who happen to have a disability or a health condition? And that was something that I hope to be able to do by leaving banking, and now I'm working on full-time in my own work. So that's a brief bio, and I wanted to get on to number one insight for me, and we'll move to the next slide and I'll explain what's on the slide. So there's a trifle of sorts. So if you're like me, you love trifle, particularly sherry trifle at Christmas time. I can never have enough of that. Why a trifle? I'll come to that. Written in large text on the left of the screen, it says, faced with layers of loss, romanticism and guilt can be a dangerous combination. So I would actually upgrade that and say, in my case, in my experience, faced with layers of loss, so losses piled on top of losses, as in a trifle, I've found that romantic notions and a guilty conscience have actually been a very dangerous cocktail for me. And I'll explain why. So in my own journey of sight loss, as I said, it was tough at the start. Back in 2002 and 3, I was angry. I was going through the stages of grief, starting with denial and anger and bargaining and all of that. But I didn't have much patience for that. When I got my accessibility accommodations and got the initial support I needed, I went back to work, and I worked hard and got on with my life as best as I could. And the sight loss continued for many, many years during my career. And then some other things started to happen around about 2018. We had a series of bereavements in the family. my sight loss was at that stage where, you know, I couldn't really run on my own anymore, which was a big, big kind of confrontation with reality that I didn't like. A significant relationship ended. I left banking after 15 years and walked out of my social connections and my professional identity to pursue a new career. And as I say that, I'm just imagining here those layers on the trifle, you know, a lot of losses piling up. And of course, me being quite the romantic guy, I think, well, sure, I'll be well fit for it, you know. So I have very much that autopilot thinking that would always say, sure, you'll be well fit for it. And that's obviously an echo of something many of us have heard in our Irish kitchens over many decades. You know, sure, you'll be grand, you'll be well fit for it. No better man, you know, and that's a real encouraging thing often, but not always, as I came to realize. The second autopilot feature that I had in me, and this I guess is a common experience of many of us in our culture, and that is having this guilty voice that says, not only can you do it, but you should do it, you know. Look at all these other people, for example, people who use a wheelchair, they can't run, and there's me able to still run. Like, why would I complain? So essentially, I realized that what these two autopilot things had done to me, or what I'd let them do to me, let's say, is they'd kind of blurred my vision, you know. I couldn't really see the fact that there were these layers of loss building up in my life and that I wasn't grieving them, I wasn't processing them. And as a counselor said to me in the early days of going to counseling, which was only in 2018-19, so it's quite late on in my journey that I started that, she said to me, Breandan, you know, it gets to the stage with loss where if there's enough layers of it piled up, it's going to knock anyone over. You know, it'll knock anybody over. And that started to wake me up to the fact that, you know what, I was going around the world with this very romantic, very guilty view on things. And it was actually that was my disability. I've come to realize that was disabling me from recognizing the reality of loss in my life, recognizing the reality of, you know, it is tough, and I am angry, and it is sad. And just making some space for that by taking off these lenses that I had, you know, figuratively speaking, it allowed me to see the extent of loss and to really just notice it and sort of nod to it and say, I can see you're there. And I feel the emotions that arises in me. And just starting that process with the help of counseling to process that and make sense of that loss. So that was my journey of discovering why, in my case, you know, getting all caught up in what I can do and what I should do. I mean, it's really helpful. Many times it's really helpful, but just noticing that having that all the time as my modus operandi actually for me ended up being a massive bug in my operating system. And like most good bugs, eventually they crash the system, and they crashed me. And that crash is what made me wake up to the fact that these are helpful lenses in our life and in our culture. There's a role for romanticism and a role for guilt to, you know, prompt us to do something, but to carry particularly guilt around in every situation, in every reflection, is actually, for me, I've discovered quite a dangerous thing for me to do. So that was my first reflection, if you like, that I wanted to share. Some of you might resonate with that, particularly around the guilt side of things, because it's such a common experience in our culture and our country. So I'll pause here before going to the next slide. If there's anything you want to write down yourself or reflect or ponder just for a moment or two, what are the autopilots that rule your life? We all have them, irrespective of level of sight, irrespective of disability or health condition. You know, what are those autopilots that we always have switched on that are actually really something we can turn off from time to time, and that might actually help us if we were to turn them off occasionally? So with that said, there's a second slide coming up that we'll turn to, and I'll describe it. It's got a lighthouse, so a familiar feature of the Irish landscape. And what it says on the left is that when our future vision gets cloudy, and I mean that in a figurative sense, you know, when the seas are choppy and there's difficult navigation out at sea, come home to our core values. So what do I mean by that? I was busy working. One of my core values is working hard. So, you know, imagine what that does to you when you've got lots of guilt in your system. I was working in the bank, you know, the hours were getting longer. I was progressing in my career, but no amount of hard work was ever enough. And I had this in the back of my head for a long time, you know, do I really care about making wealthy people richer? Like the bottom line for me, do I really care about that? Is that for me my calling in life? Or do I care about people like me with health conditions, with disabilities, or any kind of difference that causes them to be excluded and disintegrated from the country and the society that we belong to, that is ours? And, you know, as my sight deteriorated, I also realized I just can't sit in front of computer screens and deal with thousands of emails for the rest of my life. It's not efficient, you know. And I suppose in my case, when I decided to leave the bank, because I really did want to do something that would be more purposeful as a full-time job, it was quite tough. You know, I found myself full of enthusiasm and then starting to lose my way a bit. You know, the future vision started to get a bit cloudy. And that transition, like for any of us, from one place to another, from one job to another, starting a first job, taking leave for a period of time, any of these changes that we make in our lives, you know, we can get a little bit sort of clouded in our future vision, our sort of sense of navigation. And what I've found so helpful is to come back to what really makes us up, what really sits at the core of who we are, and that is our values. Who are we really? And what I'd venture to say is that irrespective of disability or health condition, or irrespective of any other characteristic for that matter, there's very little that can really change our core values. And what gave me great confidence in time, it took a long time, but in time, I started to realize as I lose my sight, okay, maybe I'm the blind guy, maybe I'm the blind lecturer, maybe I'm the blind consultant, whatever you want to call me. But you know what? I'm still the same Breandan as I always was. I still want to work hard. I still want to make a difference. I want to connect with other people on the same journey of life and help and be helped. And I realized, you know, as the path gets a bit cloudy and the seas get a bit choppy, it really helps to come back to the core values of who we are. What are the 2 or 3 things that really matter most to us as individuals? Could be family, could be work, could be sport, could be the parish, could be anything. You know yourself what it is. And my strong advice is when it does get cloudy and choppy seas out there, as it does for all of us, come back home to who you are, because that is going to be your safe harbor, and you will find new ways to express that. They might look different than before. They might look different. You might access them in different ways. But if you like GAA, maybe you can't play on the pitch, but you can still go to the match. Or if you can't see it on the television, you can listen on the radio. Or if you can't see sheet music to read, as in my case, maybe you can learn by ear. And they're just some small examples, but more and more with technology, it is possible to express who you are in different ways. And my hope is that while we go through challenges, as Peter mentioned, the last 20 months have been challenging, you know, we found ways to express our core values in new ways. And that causes us great growth and sustenance for the future. So I'll pause again just for a moment. You might like to put down a question for yourself for later on. What are my core values? You know, who am I at my depth? That's independent of sight and will never be touched by sight if you so choose. And we'll move to our third and final slide, which is coming up, and it shows a three-legged stool. So it's on the right-hand side, a three-legged stool, and that's kind of what I try to remember that I'm sitting on all the time. We do have proper chairs in Monaghan nowadays, by the way, and there are some of these still knocking around. So imagine yourself still sitting on a three-legged stool, and what's the point of that? Well, you know, don't forget that no matter the situation you're in, you get to answer the questions, the three questions, which are the three legs of the stool. What's positive? What's negative? And what do I choose? So, you know, there are people who will say, don't be going out with that white cane now, because the people will be talking and laughing at you, you know. That's quite a negative angle on things. Then there's others who will say, for God's sake, take that cane out and go for it, and to hell with everyone else, you know. And what I've learned, and it takes constant practice, so I'm not expert at it, but what I've learned to start doing is to say, you know, both of those things are true. And you know what? Here's what I choose to do. Today, I'm feeling a bit tired and I'm exhausted with the navigation hassle. I'm going to stay at home and give myself a break and have a nice cup of tea. That's my choice today. And maybe tomorrow I'll say, you know what? I'm going to the football match, I'm going to the music session, I'm going to mass, I'm going to walk by myself around the park with my cane. Whatever that choice is, that never forget that is your choice. And there will always be this three-legged stool that we can come back and sit on when our head gets a bit fried, as mine has done many times. And thanks to the counselling support, which as Peter outlined, is a fantastic resource. It helps us to get to a place where, you know, within us, we have this choice. There are positive things in every scenario, as well as negative. Don't be fooled by anyone who tries to tell you that it's all one or all the other. They're both right and they're both wrong. In the end, we do get to choose each day. And my hope is, as we progress from the conference this weekend, that we can all sit on our three-legged stool as much as possible. Recognize the positive contributions in research, for example, that we've heard over the last days. Recognize the fact that there are challenges as outlined around funding and getting it paid for. And will it come to us in time in our lifetime? And holding those two seemingly opposites together and say, what do I choose? What do I choose for my life? How will I stay in tune with the research? How will I get excited or not as I decide? And how will I map my path forward through this journey of sight loss? So with that said, there's a final slide and a quote here from Carl Jung, who I know Peter certainly knows. I'm much more a novice when it comes to these issues of psychology and psychiatry, but Carl Jung said that wholeness is not achieved by cutting away a portion of our being, but rather by integrating all the contraries. And that is true, and it's quite the journey, quite the effort, and we're never actually done at it. But as an individual, we each are called really to integrate all of us, both our abilities or what we perceive as limitations, both our losses and our potential, to pull them all together and integrate them. And as a country, it's also true. So during the week, I was with the NCBI launching their Seeing Your Career campaign with the Taoiseach. You know, I mentioned this about our country, you know, how do we integrate as our country all of the people, all of the citizens, all of the skills and talent, whether that's in vocational life, in working life, in family life, in our community. Because in the end, when we integrate within ourselves all of those different parts of us into a whole, we are complete, warts and all. I am complete with my sight loss. We are complete in our country when we have everyone included. So that's my parting message. And perhaps if there's a chance on the chat, share any reflections that might have come up for you, or indeed any questions. And if we don't have time here to dwell on them, I'd love to stay in touch and hear from you My email address is on the slide, bpw252@nyu.edu. And I hand back to Neil and to Rachel, and if there's a chance for a reflection or question from the participants, we'll take it. If not, we'll move on.
Thank you very much indeed, Breandan. We are running a little bit late, so I'm just going to ask one question. How did you get around to using the cane? And the question here is to accept using the cane. How did you deal with that one?
With difficulty, I would say. Here's what happened to me, and maybe some of the folks can relate to this that are tuned in. The risk of not using it became greater than the risk of using it, and I had to get to that stage. So in other words, I could get by for ages taking a few chances, and that was fine. The risk of not using it was lower. And the risk of using it at that time was people would look at me, they'd judge me, they'd exclude me. So for as long as the risk, as my perception of that risk was, one-sided, I didn't use it, or I used it very sparingly. Then things changed, as they often do. And I realized that I was wearing myself out with explanation, with hiding, with covering, with all sorts of caring too much about this. Actually, I just wanted to live my life. I want to go to the shop and get my own groceries. I want to go for a walk. I want to go traveling. I want to climb mountains. I realized if a piece of aluminium, whatever it's made from, is what's holding me back from embracing my values and expressing them, then I'll take the white cane. Thank you very much. So I think seeing it as an enabler is really what changed it and helped me to move from not using it and being reluctant to actually embracing it.
Thank you very much indeed, Breandan. Thank you for joining us here today. It's been a pleasure to work with you, and I know that you will continue to influence and advocate, and I hope that we can continue to work together. I'm sure your presentation today will inspire those attending.